Hello and welcome to MySecurityTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and welcome to our Tuesday afternoon episode. We're going to be walking through the IBM Cost of a Data Breach. This is an annual report from IBM Security and the analysis of 500 plus real-world data breaches. We're going to be joined by Chris Hockings, the Chief Technology Officer based up there in Queensland, and I'm here in Sydney, and both these states out of Australia are in current lockdown. So interesting times nonetheless. But this also follows on from the 2020 report where we did interview IBM on this. So looking forward to some of the findings, and quite troubling some of these findings are also. Without further ado, I'll bring on Chris Hockings, the Chief Technology Officer with IBM Security. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Good man. Thank you, Chris. So we'll just keep that going as well. I haven't interviewed a Chris for a long time. I think the last one was the astronaut, Chris, I think. But Chris, you're there in Queensland. Interesting times, to say the least, at the moment. Yeah, maybe introduce us to your role. That was one, obviously people will be tuning in for the data breach report and some of the findings there. But I think being the CTO with IBM Security in the region, I think it gives a good context to what your observations are, and then that'll lead us into the report.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And yeah, good to see so many guests that I knew as well as part of your lineup. So looking forward to sessions. Yeah, I guess my role, I've been in IBM since 2000 when our company that I worked for, that I started at university, was acquired by IBM. We were the first acquisition IBM made in the modern security era. And I am still in Queensland, and we have an R&D facility here that exports software to the global region. Actually, the people would see as those commercial products that we sell in the region. So I've been working in IBM in security for all of those years through all of the changes, and being able to stay in this area. Obviously, I've had different roles globally, Asia Pacific, but a few years ago came back here, and as part of the business, I'm helping to define the strategy, go to market, talk to all of our CISOs and people like yourself, and reflecting, I guess, our global insights and what that means locally. As an Australian citizen and a proud one at that, I want to make sure that my contribution is seen, and IBM's a great global provider for doing that. So that's kind of a bit of the background and my role. In the region, we've obviously got different capabilities as well in terms of software, which I said was in part developed out of Gold Coast in Queensland, but also we have things like our managed security services that are kind of hosted in country as well. So kind of go to market.
Well, I was going to talk about IBM, but we just had a comment. And Chris, we did mention we kind of do look alike, Chris, and thank you to Simon. Are you guys brothers? So, oh God, we do have a bit of a look-alike there. I did raise that.
I can't work without my glasses on. That's only happened in the last couple of months. So
yeah, well, look, and I'm slightly older too, mate. But where do you find IBM Security? Because you've been with the company for a long time, and IBM obviously has a long pedigree and a high sort of standing in the market. And IBM Security is again, standalone brand in its own right next to IBM. Where do you see it in the market, maybe in the region? Last year we worked with IBM on their IBM Security Summit for ASEAN, moving into Southeast Asia. How strongly do you find that IBM Security is recognised in the market, and yeah, sort of leading out the front in terms of research or the product suite as well?
It's a bit of everything, I guess, Chris. And I think the key to this space is that it's a global problem that is felt, everywhere acutely different, depending on local conditions, right? So, and if I think about all of the years, I've always been kind of on that innovation side in my research and development roles in the first 15 odd years, and I did a lot of inventing around security. Of 45 inventions now in security, in the cybersecurity space. IBM has a very rich history of innovation, as your viewers would probably recognise, and that pours in through software. So in today's era, we're talking about how do we secure workloads that are hybrid multi-cloud with our AI and data. And some of that insight from a security perspective is global threat intelligence. Some of it is context inside of customers' environments. Some of it is associated with identity. So that orientation is where we're really placing, our efforts and workload. And you'll see even in the report, and we can talk about that later, that tackling this security problem is not just about the tech, it's about how we bring people and experience. And when you talk about actionable intelligence, just an example, you really need to know where some of that activity is. And we see that through our people and the work that they do, and we make that real for our clients. So it's a mega problem, and I think it's not just something we can look at as a region and say, well, we can solve that as Australians for Australians. We need the ingredients that help counter some of the attacks that we're seeing at the global scale.
Well, that does bring us, and you're right, where I think IBM does bring that global reach, and because it's been around for a while. But this report this is its 17th year. So this is not some new annual report that's been generated for some lead gen. This really does have some real insights. And this is this is an in-depth analysis, as I mentioned at the introduction, of 500 plus real world data breaches report. And I will put the link into the show notes naturally, but it is also on the MySecurity marketplace for an immediate download. Now, I'm just going to read off some numbers here. And then, Chris, if you like, we've got some slides as well, but okay, maybe introduce us to the report and how it actually looks. It's quite well structured as well, but some of the key findings, one was 12-year history, costing companies an average of 3.7 million per incident. So this is nearly up 10% increase over the previous year. So all of the industry reports have been showing that rise in cyber-related attacks. One concern here was the data breach time to detect and contain was 311 days. So 219 to detect and 92 to contain, which is over a week longer than reported in the previous year. So not only is it costing more, but they're finding it longer to find and detect these systems. So is that generally what we've been seeing in the industry overall? Do you think where do you think the underlying reason might that be? Due to the volume has increased overall? Is that one of the key drivers, do you think?
I'll give you a few thoughts on that. I just wanted to make a comment on those in the chat. Yeah, the one thing IBM, people say they don't know IBM for security. Well, if you look at a lot of the reports that we operate in, we're leaders in the analyst area. So, but often when you're a security company inside of a large brand, it's kind of hidden under the brand, right? So anyway, audience members, you might want to go and have a look at some of that kookaburra outside. Just in terms of the report, 17 years, 12 in Australia, year on year, which gives us some really good historical data. It's based on interviews of CISOs in the country. It did increase 10% this year in currency in Australian dollar terms, and some of the factors involved in that, I guess a direct result of or indirect result of our remote working environment as well. So I think it marries up with some of the observations that led to some of the investment from through the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy 2020, where we were all of a sudden working from home. We had remote workforces, security teams were having to respond, and in some cases, you didn't have the visibility that you needed, and therefore it took longer to find some of these attacks. And that slide that you're showing there, Chris, is the US dollar figure. So it's similar, 10% year on year. Each region was subtly different. So in Asia, we had Korea, ASEAN, and India, as well as Australia. So that kind of makes up that incremental increase.
So I've got here, the shift to remote work led to more expensive data breaches, with global breaches costing over $1 million more on average when remote work was indicated as a factor in the event. 4.24 million US is quite a significant out of those 500. So it really is starting to cost companies some real money now.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the industries, there's lots of ways you can cookie cut this data, but certainly one of the trends in the global data was the emergence of healthcare being the number one. It was over $9 million US. And if you look at some of our threat intelligence data, we've got an X-Force report that comes out every year, and healthcare went from number 10 to number 7 in terms of most attacked industries, right? So we had both an increase in cost, but also an increase in the focus around healthcare, and that's pretty obvious if you look at some of the incentives for attackers, whether it's to disrupt the vaccine supply through the COVID cold chain type attacks that we saw. It was either you could exploit individuals who are suffering, for the first time some weaknesses in their personal lives, and they're looking at things like welfare campaigns, and links were being sent out, reworked, as those that were luring people into clicking on those links as well. So if healthcare was high, and it was probably an anomaly, but focused elsewhere in the world because of the massive amount of money that was pouring into healthcare. If you go to Australia, finance was always, has always been very high, and it was number one as the finance industry. So still, the attackers are seeing, finance industry being a payoff in terms of how they can extract money, which is part of the costings associated with this report. But there's lots of observations in the data.
Yeah, and I think the other one was the ransomware attacks on healthcare. They realised it was so critical, and those payments were most likely getting paid. There is some findings there in relation to that. This next one, I think I doubled up the slide on that one. The 20% of breaches caused by compromise.
Yeah, according to X-Force research, last year 23% of all attacks were ransomware related, right? So yeah. You have different views of different data, but yeah, this one just takes into account the breach, the cost, and even the circumstances by which that breach occurred. And in some of the data, we show that phishing and compromised credentials were also the highest two maneuvers or tactics that attackers use to get access to systems, which ultimately, if you're in the job of extracting funds out of companies, then that can lead to those ransomware events, right? And remote work on untrusted devices, clicking on links, can let those attackers in to do things to you that you may otherwise not have been able to, otherwise have been protected against.
Well, this is where the multi-factor comes into play, isn't it, on this one, on those compromised credentials? If there's multi-factor, you reduce the likelihood, even if those credentials are compromised. It's that extra factor that you need there. That's the main push from the industry. There's still a push back against it, but this is where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah, I mean, and that first company acquired by IBM built the first authentication solutions, and we still develop right here in Australia multi-factor authentication solutions for the clients that people on this call wouldn't know that IBM runs some of the infrastructure they deal with every day, right? So multi-factor, and when I talk to people that I know, it's the one thing you should do as an individual on all services that you can in order to secure those accounts. And if the organization that you're dealing with doesn't have multi-factor authentication, I recommend people go and provide feedback through the online forums just to force them to consider that as, a response to your trust that you're placing in them to secure the data that you've given to them, right?
Yeah. Easier said than done, but again, most sites, as you say, particularly the e-commerce sites and ones taking your money or a bit more information about you, they're the ones you really want to lock down. This one here, average breach cost without zero trust strategy. And I take it maybe you can even align to any of the product suites that you have in relation to this. So we do hear a lot of it on zero trust. Yeah,
I mean, zero trust is a term that has kind of been invented to have the communication with both the board right down to the individuals who are performing technical work, right? So it's kind of a language construct. And what we find, I mean, it's kind of no coincidence to me that an organization that has a zero trust posture, or at least an awareness that's driving that through security, would have a heightened maturity in security in general, right? Because it's a fairly, although the term's been around for a while, it's certainly gaining a lot more visibility through things like the presidential order, executive order from Joe Biden, recently, right? So for IBM, I mean, zero trust is a journey, and for anyone, it's a journey. It's about assessing where you're at with what capabilities, and combining one or more sets of services or products to do something meaningful around insight, right? And so in your example before, Chris, you talk about multi-factor authentication. I mean, that to me, multi-factor authentication, and I saw some of your other guests that were joining, when you combine, joining in other briefings, when you combine things like global threat intelligence to multi-factor authentication, you're effectively taking that zero trust posture and saying, well, what's the context around this transaction? It may not be financial, but it could be just connectivity related. What context does that suggest around the security of the connection or the operation? And should I escalate that to a higher level of certainty? And that's where multi-factor authentication can come. So increasing your, I guess, situational awareness, and the Cybersecurity Strategy 2020 talks about situational awareness in government networks. Once you do that, you can start to increase your velocity around zero trust and align it to a number of different use cases. And IBM has 4 distinct playbooks, blueprints that you can download from our website to consider where you can start your journey, because it's different for every organization based on their circumstances.
And yeah, exactly. And rolling it out into a large enterprise versus a small sort of disparate enterprise is also just as challenging as well. But as you say, it's a journey. But one of the key takeaways, and you can see that average breach cost with a mature zero trust strategy is lower, and that's in Australia. The average data breach cost was 2.73 million. And it's 1.5, so $1.5 million lower than those who had not deployed this approach at all. So that's why you hear so much about zero trust. We did speak to one CISO, Chris, who the board pushed back on zero trust. They didn't like the term zero trust, and I think that language is also very important. It's escaped me now on terms of what the alternative term that they came up with. But yeah, it was one of those things of...
Depending on the CISO, I've heard different terms that they use. Because it is one of these, when you're talking to someone who's used to managing risk that's either black or white, this is a graduated circumstance where you tell them that you can't trust that things that you've got to assume breach, that you may have attackers already in. It becomes quite a more softly approach, is talking about graduated risk or dynamic risk or whatever you use as a way to say, you know what, this is going to happen at some point. These are the things we need when it does. And if you look at the report, actually one of the best charts, and I'm a data guy, as you'd expect, is the one that talks about the impact, the positive or the reduction in cost with certain elements of programs and the increase in costs. And we found that, in that report, that there's the first couple were all about people and incident response. So it was all about forming an incident response team. And then the second one was practicing it, right? I mean, some things that you can do that actually does require the board level engagement. And then obviously technical controls are as part of that, also the methods by which you reduce, and that's things like AI and analytics and threat intelligence and those types of things. So combining the two together, that's why the security practice is about people, process and technology, can have an impact, and zero trust is one example of reducing the overall cost of a data breach. So this is really useful for your audience to take and say, okay, well, there's some quantitative evidence to suggest that if we invest in these things, there'll be some kind of return.
I think that's the good thing with these reports. There's a couple of others that we refer to quite strongly as well, that you can take these to the board and go, this is this is evidence that we can trust, and that's been verified, and again has some credit to it. Some of the key Australian key findings, and as it happened, this report was the report of the day. Every time I do a Tech and Sec Weekly, I have a report of the day. So I have introduced this already, but only very briefly. Maybe just talk us to some of the numbers here, Chris, as you see them. Can you read that okay if I raise that up a little bit?
So that's, I mean, so there's 25 organisations interviewed. There was 23,800 records leaked in each instance. As I said, 12 years,
So just to clarify that, the report's been going for 17 years, but it's only been 12 years where it's been finding Australian actual breaches as well, right?
That's right. Yeah, and, I'm not sure there's too many reports you'll get with Australian slice data even today, let alone one that's been going for a decade. So what we find is this report just becomes something that the industry uses to reflect on Australia. And if I look at the last few years, it was 10% since I've been kind of in the region. It's 10% last year. The year before it was 25%, that type of number. So things are not getting better, but I think there's a few things that I can talk about later that I think is helping, which I think is tipping the scales as well. So yeah, there's per record cost there. 3.7 million dollars lost.
So that's not $3.70 per record. That's 3.7 million.
That's right, dollars for the breach itself.
Right. Okay.
It's a combination of reputational cost, data loss costs, etc.
So there's been a few recent ones, particularly say the universities and a whole JBS in Australia was also another big one recently. So this was obviously looking at sort of last year's and finding and the recent ones, but so some of the more recent ones that we've been seeing may not be included in this one yet, right?
That's right. It was May 2020 to March 2021. This report.
Got it. Yep.
So
okay.
Get another slice of the data this time next year.
Yeah, well, it's definitely one to look out for. And the other one that I had was the top 3 industries. We mentioned healthcare, and I'll just blow that up because it looks a bit small on screen
I
for
did
me.
say healthcare from the global perspective, but yeah, this is the financial industry as number 1, technology and services as 2 or 3. So fairly typical of our historical performance in these particular domains.
Very good. Well, look, what are some of the other key takeaways that sort of pop out for you that you want to sort of raise and maybe discuss as well, that some of those key trends and observations that you're making in the industry and even some potential advice for your client base or non-client base, actually, for the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said before, the chart with the decreased increase is the one that I like to focus a lot on when I'm talking through with clients, and it does. What I love about that one is encryption is always in that list, and no one really pays a lot. No one pays for encryption unless it's data protection, right? So something like technical control that's just ingrained in the way that we do security is features on that list. But yeah, that zero trust message, I think, is really important, because when you think about zero trust, it starts to then you start to break that out. It does map to some of those mitigating controls that you can put in place, and it's not just the tech, right? It's the people and process. So if you're thinking of a zero trust circumstance, where you're talking, you might use a different term depending on the sensitivity of your industry. But when you have a conversation to a board member and say that, that when and if something happens, and let's assume that something is happening now, what do you have a plan for responding? And if you do, that's fine, but are you practicing it? I mean, I heard a story from our CEO a few years ago where made the assertion that if you were having a heart attack, the last thing you'd want to do is turn up to a hospital and talk to a doctor who'd never dealt with that situation before, right? So that piece, and then the second question with zero trust is, well, do I have the insight and the context that I need in order to make the next decision along the path, i.e. what data was lost? What do I need to do to recover? And that's where security analytics, AI, and AI being a term used to, for at-scale detection of anomalous behaviour, sometimes proactive assertions as to whether something bad is going to happen also. So I think that zero trust message is really important. And I think tying it in then to even our demands from the federal government around critical infrastructure, or even their own cybersecurity strategy, they are seeking for us to understand more and more about the workloads that are running in our environments, right? And there's a good reason for that, right? I mean, we need to know that if something is going to happen, that we know what to do to respond, right? So I think when you think about compliance and regulatory landscape, the outcome, it should be that we raise our cybersecurity awareness, and some of the data actually suggests that these regulated industries actually have better performance in terms of cost of data breach which is, to me, is obvious, but
yeah.
maybe not so for people who look at regulation and think it's a burden that they need to deal with that's with no benefit. So I think there's, whilst it's been increasing over the years, some of the digital transformation practices around hybrid, around cloud, when you bring those to the security arena and you force the monolithic practices that security vendors have been using over time to change, that's when we'll start to see things like more preventative actions based on context, threat hunting at scale that can remove these threats from your environment before they attack or expose you. And to get there, we've got a bit of a journey ahead, but I'm optimistic that what we've learned in that modernisation, digital transformation area will translate into operational benefits around resiliency for security in the longer term.
And what are you seeing, Chris, across maybe even just Asia Pacific, but also here in Australia, in terms of that uptake, that digital transformation, cloud adoption? Generally, the uptake is strong. Is that same observations with you, and maybe at what pace you might judge it at?
Well, I think the pain points are there. I mean, if you look at the reason we went down, or the industry went down, the containerization and modernization and digital native approach, is because the pain associated with building, managing, and operating large-scale centralized compute was cost prohibitive and inflexible, right? And if you look at security today, we're starting to see the same headwinds, and it can be even worse because the attackers do not have that disadvantage, right? So when you look at multi-cloud and the distribution of workload away from the core, and you think about some of the practices we've applied in digital transformation in that domain, IBM at least is working on an open ecosystem approach to addressing this problem at scale by bringing together insights across all of these environments without having to move the data to the core. And when you start talking about that and you start infusing things like open standards and open practices and open source and those types of behaviors, and it's no coincidence that Red Hat, was acquired by IBM as a conduit to providing that, then I can see that that world is coming, right? Because we're going to have compliance requirements. We've got attackers who are well equipped and well resourced, and we need to digitally transform the way security is done. So I'm optimistic that this is the missing ingredient to getting ahead of this problem over time. But it certainly takes CISOs and security leaders to think about that problem in a new way and to take a bit of a leap forward in that regard.
Do you think it's changing the way IBM is as well, and the way it sees itself, maybe less proprietary orientated, but more towards that open source understanding that you're going to be in a multi-cloud environment, that you need to be able to integrate and have APIs that talk, and then also from the security mindset, you need to have a presence there as well?
Yeah, and interestingly, I'm from IBM in the innovation side, and we've always had an open approach in that area. I mean, if you look at things like even our old name Tivoli, it was all about systems management across heterogeneous open platforms running Solaris, AOX, Linux, or Windows. We were kind of agnostic, and we wrapped our arms around that and provided those non-functional benefits to our clients in that regard. I see multi-cloud as being that problem at scale. So obviously the culture of Red Hat has come in and provided a new platform for us to deliver, not Linux, not just Linux, right? But also there's Red Hat Linux, but also the OpenShift platform as a way to innovate on top. That gives us that benefit of looking at this multi-cloud problem, but also on-prem, and bring it all together to provide that situational awareness that our clients need to act faster. And in IBM, in security, you'll hear these terms. In IBM, you'll hear these terms called cloud packs. We've got one called Cloud Pack for Security, which is about doing that for data, identity, fraud, and threat management as the core domains, and working with our ecosystem partners. I mean, I'm regularly talking to people that you would generally consider, competitors, in a cooperative fashion to look at our client problems and saying, how do we deal with this this challenge together? Because it's not about rip and replace software. It's about you've chosen this route for this purpose and this reason. How do we use that tool or that system in an interoperable fashion with other systems at scale to deliver this and cut through your costs and deliver it at scale. So quite a large strategic picture, but you can see over time we've got a fairly clear view of where we're heading as a company in security.
I like it, and I think it does provide. Obviously, you have a client profile there, large enterprise, and the ones that can match and need that globalization view and that global view and that global skill set as well. I can see very well aligned to certain sort of client profiles, and you bring a lot of that expertise, I suppose, with you. What are some of the other exciting things? You're the CTO for APAC, and that's IBM Security, obviously, but you must have sort of insight across IBM, talking to the other CTOs, and I imagine there's one key CTO as well that you might report to. But yeah, maybe two questions there, Chris. What's the structure of the CTO? Because I imagine they might have CTOs around the world that you all group together with and also learn from. And then some of those exciting things that you think we should be looking out for, maybe second half of the year or into 2022.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, IBM's kind of loosely coupled set of alliances, and I would, I guess as I grew up through this role, I formed partnerships with people who are largely in that R&D area, and our CTO in security globally owns the research agenda as well as the technical staff that are delivering our products and services portfolio as well. So yeah, we generally get together. I mean, if I think about the open piece, it's really important, and I think it's the key ingredient, one of the key ingredients. When I say open, I think of open standards primarily, which have enabled things like interoperability at scale, things like SAMLs, sticks and taxi. We don't even think about it anymore. We just connect a few buttons, and next thing we're sharing information with trusted partners that requires no configuration, no technical work, right? So we're doing a lot of work in what's called the Open Cybersecurity Alliance, which is about enabling the interoperability of products installed inside of our client environments to reduce complexity. OCA it's part of OASIS, and you'll see a bunch of standards coming out that IBM's just a co-contributor to, but one of the originators of the standards piece. So that's a really exciting area. There's all sorts of threat hunting languages, all sorts of open source. Body is actually running in parallel as an open source project as well. So you don't have to wait for the documents, interoperability events, etc. You can just start using and contributing to that, and you'll see a whole lot of vendors in that area. The other thing that's really interesting is, between IBM Security as an enterprise security company and then Red Hat as well, you see acquisitions being made in Red Hat that are in security, focused on whether it's container level detection and response with things like StackRox. But you'll also see IBM contributing research assets into that domain as well as open source. So it's a new way of working. And as Red Hat as an ecosystem partner, as anyone else is, bringing that together in an enterprise security scenario is really, really exciting for me. And I think the last one is, that I get to work in a region here with the capability that I have behind me to contribute to the national agenda. And the ride is up and down. I mean, we technologists in government is really important because we do understand the practicalities of implementation of certain things, and being able to help in that area as the global connectivity into the region is a really exciting proposition for us. And when you look at a lot of the people, the community around Australia, and certainly a lot of them are working, some of them work in IBM, some of them are in ecosystem partners and SIs. This is a team sport, and we do have to get together and work out together how this is going to play out from a national perspective. And yeah, it's exciting, probably why I'm at IBM for, people always ask, why would you be at IBM for 23 years? Well, I think hopefully you got the answer out of this discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, I always think, I always like meeting people with a real job, but someone who's been in the job for 23 years with a company like IBM, I think it does, it reflects well on IBM as well in terms of the type of culture that it forms. apart from you being in sort of God's country there in South Queensland. So I'm sure you're quite happy where you are. And just to be fair to Simon, he's actually gone and read the report, which is good. But he's got a question here: policy around the end of life of the data-bearing devices. Yeah, maybe a thought there, Chris, to close off on the end of life. And I think Simon is in sort of the storage realm. So once the media storage has reached its end, what does IBM recommend for the data sanitization and disposition beyond encryption? So what do you do with those end devices? And is there a policy around that you're aware of?
I can tell you IBM has a process for everything. And, you know, being a trusted service provider, data destruction will be part of that process. I don't have the details, but Simon, I can definitely share those with you if you ping me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
The other thing you'll find with IBM is most of our policies are open and transparent online. Even have a lot of discussion around our disclosure, policy, and it's all about being open and so IBM as a global brand has a lot to lose if there's any trust implications of the work of technical work that we do.
Well, imagine most of it's also in the data centers now. So all of that is quite tightly controlled in terms of standards. I think standards is the key term there for all things. So thank you to Simon for your contribution there, and also to those that other comments as well. And thanks for listening. Now we're about on time. So look, Chris, on that note, thank you so much for your time. Do appreciate it. And I'm just going to share my screen so before I do a close off. So I've got you nice there. No, hang on, wrong one. There you go. I've had my second Pfizer, folks, so I'm a little bit cloudy today. I'm going to let you know I've gone away with it okay, but I'm going to take the rest of the day off after this, I'll tell you right now. So look, thank you so much for that, Chris. I do appreciate it. And our next sort of report of the day is VMware, but yeah, there you go. I'll walk through that shortly. So look, Chris Hockings, beg your pardon, the Chief Technology Officer with IBM Security. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us on our Tech and Sec Weekly.
Thanks, Chris. Looking
forward. Appreciate it, mate. I'll put you
Yeah.
backstage. Thanks again. Have a good day. Okay, very good. And plenty there to unpack, I suppose, is one a bit of a term. And as I mentioned, the report of the day here following that one is VMware. Their Global Incident Response Threat Report has just come out. And according to their respondents, 34%, or 1/3 of all attacks in the past 12 months leveraged cloud computing, which was an interesting one. And a similar percentage, 34%, were aimed at cloud workloads. So as everyone moves to the cloud, guess where the attackers are going to be heading? 49% there. The imminent concern, according to Kellerman, is that cloud jacking becomes the future of island hopping. This past year, island hopping was seen in 49% of all attacks, and the number might actually be higher than reported, given the use of home networks for such attacks. And the other one, this is also coming to ransomware. On average, respondents told us that ransomware attackers demand about 300,000 and organisations pay about 240,000. So always ask for that 20% discount. And then nearly 20% of attackers ask for more than 750,000 in ransom, and only 6% of organisations paid ransoms of that size or more. The vast majority paid ransoms less than 500 grand, and 21% said they did not pay at all. Worth having a look at, say, the latest Kaseya ransomware demand of 70 billion down to 50 billion, but they didn't pay, and a few others. And I know Palo Alto Networks, their recent report on ransomware also showed similar trends. So look, that's it from us on our Tech and Sec Weekly. Like I said, go get vaccinated. You might feel a bit foggy on the second one the day after, but otherwise it's well worth it. We'll see you on Friday for our Space edition on Friday morning. Thanks for joining us.